Next, we want to look at how to solve quadratic equations. We have already learned that polynomials, including quadratic equations, can be solved using the zero product property once the polynomial is factored and set equal to 0. You would then just set each of the factors equal to 0 and solve the resulting equations. So for this example, we want to solve this equation. So we need to factor out the greatest common factor. So if we look at 6 and 18, the biggest number that we can take out of both of them is 6. If I look at x squared and x, they have x in common. So now in parentheses we write what we have left. So what do I have to multiply 6x by to get 6x squared? And the answer is x. What do I need to multiply 6x by to give me the 18x I started with? And that's plus 3. Okay, so now that we have it factored and we have it equal to 0, so remember factoring is really the opposite of the distributive property. So now that it's factored and equal to 0, we can apply the zero product property. So we set each factor equal to 0. So 6x equals 0, or x plus 3 equals 0. Dividing both sides by 6, we get x equals 0 for one of our answers. Subtracting 3 from both sides, we get x equals negative 3 for our other answer. All right, so this is solving using the zero product property. Okay, a new property we're going to learn about today is called the square root property. If you have something squared equal to some number that we're calling a, then x is equal to plus or minus the square root of whatever a was. Okay, so let's apply that to our example below. We want to solve these equations by using the square root property. So in part A, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we have something squared on one side of the equation. So my first step is going to be to divide both sides by 3. Okay, so once we do that, we end up with x squared is equal to 12. So now it's in the same format as my property, which tells me that x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 12. Okay, so now our only chore is to simplify the square root of 12. Okay, well 12 does have a factor that's a perfect square, and that factor is 4. So we can write it as 4 times 3. Well, the square root of 4 is equal to 2, but we're still left with the square root of 3. So that would be our answer. Okay, going on to part B. All right, we're going to be able to use the square root property with this expression as well because we have something squared. However, the thing that's being squared needs to be isolated on one side of the equation. So my first step is going to be to subtract over the 64. So we have x minus 5 squared equal to negative 64. Now I'm ready to apply the square root property. So I'm just going to be left with my x. In this case, it'll be x minus 5. You're just getting rid of the square. And that's going to equal plus or minus the square root of whatever's on the right side of the equation, which is negative 64. Okay, so we have x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus. Well, I know that I can bring an I outside of the square root to get rid of the negative, and the square root of 64 is 8. So we're actually left with an 8i. Okay, well, we still haven't solved this equation because to solve means to get x by itself. So my last step is to add 5 to both sides. So we're just going to put the 5 in the front. So we're going to have 5 plus 8i and then 5 minus 8i. So we can just leave it as a plus or minus. And those are our two answers. completing the square. This method enables you to write any quadratic equation in a format that you can then use the square root property that we were just going through. So I have the steps written out for how to complete the square. So I'm going to go through those steps with you as we work through our first example. Okay, the first step, you want to move your variables on one side of the equation and your numbers on the other. So we need to subtract 4 from both sides. So we have our 4x squared minus 8x equals -4. Next, we want to divide both sides of the equation by the coefficient of x squared if it is not 1. Okay, the coefficient of x squared for us is 4, so we need to divide everything by 4. Okay, so that leaves us with an x squared minus 2x, leave a little space, equals -1. Next, we want to take half of the coefficient of x and square this number. Add it to both sides of your equation. So we're taking half of -2, which is -1, squared is going to be +1. So we're adding 1 to both sides. Once you do that, you can now factor your expression into some quantity squared. And I have a little hint up there for you, because if you're dealing with some numbers that are a bit more difficult, this is a way that you know what your factored expression is going to be. The value that you obtain after dividing by 2, when you take the coefficient of x, divide it by 2, we got -1, that's going to be the number in our factored expression. So this is going to factor into x minus 1 quantity squared equals -1 plus 1 is 0. All right, well now we have something squared equal to a number, so we can apply the square root property. So that property said that we just drop the square, so we have x minus 1 will equal plus or minus the square root of whatever's on the other side of the equation. In this case, it's 0. Well, the square root of 0 is just 0, right? Plus or minus doesn't matter because it's 0. So our last step is going to be to add 1 to both sides, and we end up with x equals 1 is our answer. Okay. All right, well, let's apply completing the square to our example in part B. Okay, so first step, I want to move my number to the other side of the equation. So I have x squared plus x, leaving a little space, is equal to 6. Okay, next I need to take half of the coefficient of x and square that number. Okay, well, we don't have a number written in front of x, so that means that the understood coefficient is a 1. So if I take half of 1, that's just a half, and then squared is 1/4. Okay, so that's what I need to add to both sides of my equation. All right, and this is where my little hint will probably come in handy, since I know many of us don't like to work with fractions. Well, we know that the first term is going to be x. When I took half of the coefficient of x, that's going to be the number that goes in my parentheses. So half of 1 was just 1/2. So that'll be my factored expression. Okay, so now we need to combine 6 plus 1/4. You can use your calculator to do that. Or 6 is the same as 24 over 4, plus 1 gives us 25 over 4. All right, so we've done the hardest part. We have something squared equal to a number, so now we can apply the square root property. So that means we're going to drop the square, and now I have to do plus or minus the square root of whatever's on the other side of the equation. Okay, well, if we look at the right-hand side, both 25 and 4 are perfect squares, so we can simplify that, because that means we're just taking the square root of 25 over the square root of 4, So we have x plus 1/2 is equal to plus or minus 5/2. Okay, we still need to get our x by itself, so I'm going to subtract 1/2 from both sides. So we end up with negative 1/2, and we still have that plus or minus 5/2. Now there are a couple of ways you can write it at this point. One way, since we have the same denominator, you can combine these by writing negative 1 plus or minus 5 divided by 2. But since we're dealing with all numbers here, we can actually evaluate this. So we have negative 1 plus 5/2, which is the same thing as 4/2, which equals 2. And then we need to do the negative case. Negative 1 minus 5 divided by 2, which is negative 6/2, which is negative 3. And those would be our two answers for x.